right? Are you watching Newsfeed? We edging closer to that announcement. In fact, my colleague sitting with me in studio, Nonincentive, our business editor, telling me that that figure is out. I'm not going to be the one to break it. Let me leave it to the man whose business it is to watch what is happening in the business space, and you don't look...
Yeah, no, it's a hard one to swallow, this one. South Africa's unemployment rate went up in the second quarter by 1.8%. That's, tens of thousands of jobs going out the window, and that took it up from 32.6% to 34.4%. Still, another quarter where we are talking about the highest unemployment rate in the history of South Africa. And when you look at, some of these, you'll expect, restaurant jobs in the leisure sector to have lost, to have been lost a lot, because these lockdowns are affecting the leisure sector a lot. The hotels, the restaurants, your resorts. There are a lot of jobs that we expect to be announced that have been lost in that particular quarter. But it's something that is really should worry everyone from private sector, civil society, that when we've just come from a civil unrest that we saw decimated, parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, driven largely by people, young people, also who are dissatisfied, who are easy to, spark into, use every other reason rather than just former President Jacob Zuma being in prison. It could have been any reason. All they need is just a reason to justify their actions.
Yeah.
And this is why, actually, South Africa has been named as one of the most, vulnerable countries when it comes to civil unrest of this nature. It's because young people are sitting at home without any hope of any bright future at all. And these numbers are huge, huge worry.
Well, let's bring into the conversation Pax Africana Holdings Director and Economist, who joins us for this conversation, Ndumiso Hadebe. Well, Hadebe, you have heard the latest figures. That figure has gone from 32.6, now sitting at 34.4%. That's the unemployment rate in the country. Your thoughts, please.
I think the 34.4% figure is certainly not that surprising, especially when we look at the context of the number of liquidations that took place in the first 4 months of 2021, which had increased by 55% when comparing it to the same period last year. And so this is consequential to what the impact that this has had on businesses, and of course the employment prospects for people that are employed both in formal and informal work as well in the South African economy. What is consistently a strong recurring theme is certainly the folks who are not in employment, education or training. That particular cohort of people, specifically young people, are the ones that Xolani makes reference to that continue to become vulnerable and become susceptible to what we have seen in the social unrest that we saw in South Africa over the past couple of weeks. And that is of particular concern if we are to look at where the South African economy is going forward, because what we know is that the South African economy and structure reward non-intensive sectors. So if you find an instance where young people aren't able or participate in those areas, it basically displaces them out of being economically active, which is something that we need to pay close attention to.
Yeah, you speak about the non-intensive sectors that this economy prefers to absorb people. While I give my colleague here, Nonincentive, some time to just look through this statement to check for us specifically which sectors contributed to the latest unemployment figures. Talk to us about these non-incentive sectors. What are you talking to specifically there?
So in this instance, knowledge-intensive sectors referred to the sectors that contribute the most towards the South African economy. So if we are to look at the contribution in terms of nominal GDP of industries that contribute the most to the South African economy, the industries that come out tops are business, finance, and services. So these are knowledge-intensive sectors such as professional services, consulting, and so on and so forth. Then you have another sector such as manufacturing, which is quite an important sector, which is also a meaningful contributor to nominal GDP, but also in terms of employment as well. And those specific types of sectors, they require a certain level of base or medium skill set and above in order to participate in them. Whereas the sectors, for instance, that Olani made reference to earlier, such as the tourism sector, for example, it's able to absorb young people that don't necessarily have post-schooling qualifications. Whereas we do know that in the South African context, there's a large number of young people who do not have post-schooling qualifications. Even when we look at the unemployment number, we see that unemployment amongst young people who have less than matric is certainly quite higher compared to young people who are graduates, for example. When you look at graduate unemployment, it's around 9% there or thereabout. And when you look at unemployment for young people who have less than matric, it's certainly north of 30%. That is quite indicative of the kind of skills that the South African economy is able to reward. And as a consequence, it's therefore important for us to then ask ourselves the questions as to what are we going to do to ensure that these young people that fall within this, what is characterized as the NEET rate, not in employment, education, or training, so that they can be able to respond to the labor demand in the South African economy and be able to assist the businesses that operate in the areas of business, finance, professional services, manufacturing, and of course the tourism sector as well, in order to deal with this question quite more meaningfully of youth unemployment in South Africa.
Ndumiso, that is quite important what you're talking about, because if you take the number currently of those who are actually actively looking for a job and don't have a job, 7.8%, and you put it together with the number of people who have given up looking for jobs, 3.3 million, you actually, it's not even getting to the 13.3 million South Africans who are young, who are actually not in any training, in any training activity or education, and those are the people that we should be worried about. One other thing that has just come out is the labor absorption rate, which has gone up by 1.1% in the second quarter. Explain the importance of that figure to us.
The labor absorption rate is certainly indicative of this concept or this idea that we're referring to in terms of the responsiveness of labor demand and labor supply in the South African economy. That rate is indicative as to whether the South African economy is indeed able to make leeway in terms of being able to be responsive to the labor demands in the labor market. Oftentimes, when we refer to the structural, and I'm sure you've heard this quite often, structural unemployment in South Africa, it refers to this idea of there being a mismatch of skills in terms of the quantity of labor demanded in the economy versus the quantity of labor that economy is able to supply. That is quite important, especially when you look at it in the context of the evolutions that is currently taking place in industry, where because of the COVID-19 pandemic, increasingly more and more businesses are starting to digitize and automate certain processes. We're seeing RPA, robotic process automation, being a prominent feature in terms of automating processes in businesses. We're seeing artificial intelligence technologies also playing a role in terms of creating those efficiencies. It then becomes quite difficult when you don't have young people who have those skill sets to render services to businesses or even government as well, to be able to create those enhancements. In the private sector, for example, these category of initiatives are typically referred to as digital transformation initiatives. Now, given that the world of work is changing, it's also important that in interventionist supply-side policies from a basic and higher education point of view, that we then start building the skills base that is able to supply the market with these kinds of skills that are required. And so a labor absorption rate refers to those dynamics in the labor market in the South African context. And then as well, then it gives us the insights that we need in order to be able to respond to them more meaningfully and quite effectively as well.
Yeah. Ndumiso, last question from my side. Government, the role it plays in coming up with policy that is then an enabler for businesses to thrive. The ANC government, it's been said a number of times that it is good on coming up with policy. The problem is implementation. And interestingly, we have today a man who sits in National Treasury whose importance in the governing party is that of developing and driving economic policy. The role that government has to play now in a situation where the country finds itself, what would that role be?
The role that government has to play, given especially the data that we receive today, certainly cannot be understated. And this is particularly important when we look at similar countries to South Africa that have led a specific development path that has either been able to achieve certain economic objectives and those that have not been able to do so. A classic case in point is, for instance, the case of Singapore, which is not a resource-endowed country, for example. It was basically an island that certainly had no resources that they could back up in terms of the economy. And the key driver of that economy has been centered on human capital development, which I think there are similar features in the South African context as well. But one of the important enablers of being able to achieve these macroeconomic objectives and in dealing with unemployment where the state is concerned is that strong institutions and policies then become an enabler for the achievement of these macroeconomic goals. You can have a situation, for instance, where we have a grand plan around dealing with the question of youth unemployment or unemployment broadly, and we have the requisite policies that ought to ensure that we're able to achieve that. But the moment you don't have institutions that are implementation orientated and also are able to monitor and evaluate the progress and make iterations where required quite speedily and quite efficiently, then it all certainly becomes a pipe dream. And so the role of the state in this context becomes quite important in all spheres to be able to deliver on these objectives. And I think in the South African context more particularly, a key focus on the role of local government in particular is quite important, because that is where investment happens. Yeah. When you, Polly, are making considerations about opening a manufacturing business in a specific region, be it in the south of Johannesburg, you are going to consider the effects of the bylaws on you being able to make that investment, whether or not you'd be able to get the labor that you need, whether or not you're able to receive your utility bills on time and if they're accurate. So those things are quite critical where the state is concerned.
Ndumiso, 580,000 people in a space of a few months lost their jobs. But what's interesting here is that formal sector employment decreased by 375,000, while other sectors experienced increases in employment in the second quarter of this year. Informal sector employment increased by 7.4% at 184,000. What does that say about the current situation when it comes to the employment landscape in this country?
Yeah, that is certainly indicative of the labor market trends that we have in South Africa, where you find instances where the sector that has received a significant amount of pressure, especially as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, has certainly been the formal sector. And of course, the pressure on margins in that sector as well. And of course, because of the related formalization and compliance-related issues, there's been significant amount of pressure as well in that instance. And then you see that permeation in the informal sector, where now folks are now increasingly participating in more and more informal work to be able to make means and to be able to survive. I think it also is indicative of some of the what can be referred to as the survivalist nature of entrepreneurship that then is found to be expressed as a consequence of this difficult period, where yes, indeed, we do know that the South African people are indeed resilient, and we're certainly seeing it through this theme of survivalist entrepreneurship that is coming through in this data. However, the only downside to this is there's a question around its sustainability and whether or not it's able to grow the South African economy given the population growth rates that we certainly do anticipate in South Africa, but also that we anticipate in the African continent as a whole, and also in the context of what the policy reforms that are currently taking place in preparation for the African Continental Agreement and the resultant impact on the various sectors on the South African economy. So it's certainly quite indicative of labor market trends that we've seen recently, but I think more importantly, it's quite telling about what we urgently need to do and accelerate our efforts in being able to meaningfully transform the South African economy so that more and more people are able to expand the base and participate meaningfully in the economy as well.
Ndumiso Hadebe, an economist, joining us for this important conversation.